Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me okay, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Do you want me to obviously get started then?
Yeah. Let's take it away.
Okay, you in Australia, is it?
Yeah.
What part?
Yeah.
What part of Australia?
Oh, what part of Australia? Just south of Sydney, a little town called Wollongong.
I know one guy. I'm in Bondi right
Oh,
now.
wonderful.
No. All right, cool. Obviously, to get started, obviously I'll be arguing for, I think the facts of the 9/11 Commission are inaccurate. Can you just, when I'm talking, just put it on mute because there's a lot of background noise coming off.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just jump in if you want, like at any stage, okay?
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, obviously to start going through it, I'm not going to tell you I'm a physicist and start dissecting you probably have watched plenty of documentaries about planes hit the buildings and millions of different kind of arguments that people have. And so I'll just probably talk about what the commission report doesn't have accurate, okay? So there's bits of it that are not accurate. There's a lot of truth of it. Obviously, I think that there was Al-Qaeda hijackers involved, but I also think that it leaves out a lot of different elements, which we'll probably discuss for this conversation. So some of the points that the commission report gets wrong, and which means that it's inaccurate, is obviously the first report didn't even have a building 7 in it. They didn't mention that a building 50-foot skyscraper completely disintegrated out of the ground and blown up that day. So that's one major thing that it's obviously inaccurate about. And two, there was obviously hundreds of reports and news reports. You could watch several different news outlets about reporting about people reporting on bombs being exploded, live witnesses saying that there's bombs exploded. You just put that on mute.
Yeah, sorry, man. I'm just having a little bit of trouble actually finding out how to do that.
Yeah, I don't know. Just one second. Maybe if you go to your mixer, I think maybe you put your microphone on mute then.
Yeah, that's not that time. All right, keep going. I'm gonna see if I can figure out how to do this.
Yeah, so obviously there was hundreds of reports, and obviously hundreds of reports that aligned with the actual statements what happened, but they didn't once report anything to do with bombs in the complete commission report. Not once is it mentioned, even though there was hundreds of reports there, and you could obviously watch live witness testimonies of it. They also made a lot of errors in the report, so again, it's inaccurate. They said Mohammed Atta didn't come to the US until June 2001. They said they didn't know anything about him. Obviously, 5 or 6 years later, it turns out they were tracking him from that Hamburg cell that he was in, and they had him tracked when he was pretty much the whole way. They also said in the commission report that they had no forewarning that anything like this was possible or anything like this can happen. That obviously 6 or 7 years later, that came out to be a complete lie. France had given a warning, Germany had given a warning, Italy had given them a warning of similar types of using planes to fly into buildings, not specifically obviously the trade towers, but just to fly into landmarks. So those are two massive lies. Also in it, and even the House Senate Committee admitted in 2012, you can't really trust a lot of the information in it because 1/3 of it is taken from the interrogation of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was obviously in Guantanamo Bay, and he was waterboarded, was it like 163 times? And even after, lots of the stuff came out that he said when he was getting waterboarded turned out to be a lie. He started saying that there was like, they were using black Muslims up in Montana to organized terrorist campaigns. That turned out to be a lie. So it came out that actually when people are waterboarded, a lot of the stuff they're saying is in line with what the interrogators want them to say in order to fucking stop getting waterboarded. They also didn't mention in the report that a lot of the evidence was immediately taken away. So Giuliani had about 200 trucks come and take all the steel away from the buildings, brought down to, I forget the name of the shipping yard, and exported to China and sold the steel. So lots of evidence was obviously tampered with, and that wasn't reported. And even the guys involved in the commission report, even like Lee Hamilton, he even said that the report that their investigation was severely hampered because Department of Homeland Security wouldn't tell them anything, CIA wouldn't tell them anything. So automatically they said that, you know, a lot of what happened in the report ended up not being the full story of events. And maybe do you want to just have a jump in there and kind of tell your side of things, what you think, and we could take it from there? I can't hear you. Your camera's not on and I can't hear you. I'm not sure if you're saying anything. Must have been a compelling argument.
I think we're back. You there?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, cool. The time is kind of restarted again. I think we're about 10 minutes in, so we'll just wrap it up a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, so just a couple of things to go on for. So I think we'll get back to it once I've kind of going through some of the points that you brought up. But it'd be interesting to sort of hear what your perspective on the whole kind of events leading up to 9/11 and the actual sort of like intentions and stuff of 9/11 are, because you were saying that you don't disagree that Al-Qaeda flew planes into the Twin Towers. But then you're also saying some of the things of like there was no evidence that bombs were found or anything. That does kind of sound like you're sort of buying into some of the theories that people have about how there were parts of there were a controlled demolition and other things like that. So just sort of like giving a picture of specifically what you think sort of was the story there might kind of help add some clarity to this debate. So just to go through the points that you sort of brought up one by one. So the first thing you said that like, okay, well, I guess what we'll start with is that the purpose of the report. So when you said that there was no indication of Building 7 or any of the things that Building 7 went down, that's true. There wasn't much to say about Building 7 in the 9/11 report. There was stuff to say about Building 7 in a subsequent report that was published in tandem. There was the engineering report. I think it was the NISIS or something like that. That did talk about Building 7. And the reason why Building 7 wasn't mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report is because it wasn't, it kind of collapsed, sort of adjacent to, as a fallout from the main towers coming down. And so it wasn't super relevant. The purpose of the 9/11 Commission report was to find out, firstly, sort of what were the events that happened to the main towers collapsing, what were the people behind it responsible, and what the kind of like climate was sort of going into that. So them failing to leave out or failing to mention, certain buildings that were not particularly relevant to the actual lead up of the events that kind of chain react into a bunch of things doesn't necessarily mean that they're inaccurate. And I think when you're saying that there was some other sort of stuff that you mentioned that they kind of left out of the report, sort of like leaving out certain evidence or details that may not have appeared in the report doesn't mean that the report itself is inaccurate. Like, in fact, like if we just think about it, there are lots of things that the 9/11 report probably leaves out, because in order to, encompass literally everything that could be potentially relevant to it, it would go from being a 500-page document to a 5,000-page document, even more, right? Like there's always more detail, more things that you can add to a particular report. It's the decision of the people who are writing the report to try to trim those details down into the things that they think are the most relevant. So just because something that has been left out doesn't necessarily invalidate the accuracy of the report. If you say so, so the second thing you're saying is you're mentioning something about bombs at the base of the tower, that they didn't mention any evidence. It's because as far as I know, there wasn't any evidence that there was any kind of controlled demolition. The collapse of the towers is completely coherent with planes flying into them and the reactions of jet fuel burning that would cause the kind of unstructural stability of the towers and therefore lead to their collapse. So saying that there was no findings that any of that happened, is evidence that it would be accurate. You were saying that there was the 9/11 Commission report said that had no warning that these things were going to take place, but they had warning that France and Germany and other things said that there was possibility of people hijacking airplanes to use for these malicious intents. Just because there are certain countries that have said, this is a possible means that extremists are using to attack people, doesn't necessarily draw any conclusions that the report that the people who are writing the report can say, oh well, we then the natural thing to then assume is that they were going to take this particular action, right? Like at any given moment in time, there's some sort of we can assume kinds of people that want to take certain actions and possible methods that they have to use. Like for example, we know now that ISIS is a violent militant group who would take certain kind of actions against certain kind of targets. That doesn't mean that we have any evidence to suggest that they are going to take specific actions against specific targets. So merely motive and method does not necessarily indicate that they knew about something happening beforehand, right? To say that that it includes testimony of a person that was waterboarded that that ended up later being a lie. I think that you sort of disproved your own point when you said that the testimony of people who are waterboarded is not something that can really be taken on face value. And in fact, if they were just reporting on the testimony of someone who was waterboarded, it is true that he said those things. Whether or not those things ended up being accurate is another thing altogether. And in fact, we have good evidence to sort of believe that they wouldn't be accurate, because it has later come out, as you yourself pointed out, the testimony from people who are being tortured is not often going to be reliable testimony, because most of the time people will want to just say things to kind of, escape their tormentors. So, I mean, those are the main things that I sort of have. I guess my sort of opening statement to this is that the main overall theme of the 9/11 Commission report seems to indicate the geopolitical motive behind the 9/11 attacks, which was Al-Qaeda wishing to launch a terrorist attack on United States soil, and that seems to have been pretty conclusively proven by the following, by the events of that day, and indeed sort of the following events after that. So I think that overall, the sort of suggestion and identification of the people involved, the kinds of motives that they had behind it, and the methods that they used to undertake those things, broadly speaking, are all quite accurate. So I think, if you want to sort of, respond to any of those larger things or point out more sort of examples, we can continue that way.
Yeah, so probably the first thing about Building 7, you're saying they didn't put it in the first report, and the only reason they had that second report came out was because the families of the 9/11 victims came together in mass protests and demanded why wasn't these buildings included in the report. So that's, and you said, oh, they can't put everything in there. It was just to deal with certain facts. I was like, well, a 50-foot skyscraper falling out of the building or out of the air, it's pretty important to me, and it's pretty important to a lot of people. You think that would have been at least written about. They might have not even delved into the whole rationale, how a building collapsed, even though a plane didn't hit it, kind of theories, but at least spoke about it in the report. But to totally omit it kind of seems, fishy to me. The bomb reports, there was also people arrested. So the FBI actually arrested 5 guys, Mossad agents, that had a van that tested positives for explosives. These guys failed polygraph tests, and they were working for a company called Urban Moving Systems. They were, their testimonies obviously were caught out on many lies. One of them reported, so basically what happened with these guys, and this is the FBI reports, you can read them, get a Freedom of Information Act to read them. They said they're in the Urban Moving Systems building, and they're on top. This is what they claim, that they're on top of the building, and they started taking pictures once the first plane hit, and then decided they didn't have a full view of it, so had to move to another building and get a complete view. Now, when they're at the second building, there were several witnesses that saw them taking pictures and laughing and cheering at the collapse of the terrace. The thing about what makes their statement a lie, obviously, was the fact that their pictures actually clearly proved that they were actually in the second location when the Twin Towers hit. So why they were on top of this building preemptively before the first plane hit the building taking pictures is pretty weird. Now, what also happened was there was another van that was reported on all the major news outlets to also carry explosives and was heading towards the George Washington Bridge. It was the same, also urban moving systems, the same that those two guys were also caught in. There was another urban moving systems van in Philadelphia near where that second plane landed. The reason, obviously, I think these guys were involved, I think, because this probably ties in with your point, what I kind of think happened in on the events. So I think, obviously, it was a joint operation with Al-Qaeda. There was Mossad obviously involved, because now there was many reports that there was about 1,000 Mossad operatives running around the United States pre 9/11. Now, these specific guys, when it came out, they were actually following the hijackers around in Florida. They lived next door to them in Florida, and then subsequently in New Jersey prior to the attacks. So these guys were actually following, and this isn't like a conspiracy theory or anything like that. You could read the FBI reports about that. I'm not sure if you have. So I think that they were also involved in the attacks, and they planted bombs into the buildings coincidentally with the planes hitting it. Building 7 was not hit by a plane. It came down, and the commission report will say it came down due to office fires because there was a sprinkler system not working. Okay, and the report will say that, and due to extensive office fires, the buildings collapsed. Now, what the report then also leaves out was that there was 4 guys arrested that had passes to fix the sprinkler systems to the Building 7, and they're arrested. They had licenses to fix them. They weren't plumbers. They're obviously fake licenses, and they got all their fake IDs and fake licenses from, I'll get the guy's name up for it, but he was another Israeli operative working in Tennessee. So there was lots of different fingerprints of different factions all over it. And also, who would have the capabilities to penetrate a security system in order to plant the bombs? And the security company running out of all the buildings, that company called Securicom, also had the security for several of the airports that the hijackers boarded the planes from. The Port Authority said they had never licensed these guys to work in the buildings, but somehow these guys managed to get in and fix the sprinklers a couple of days before the alleged bombs went off. Also, not in the report, and I think it's also coincides with the bombs, is the fact that one of the elevator shafts in one of the buildings was not working. Now, it wasn't working for a month, which is obviously pretty, you could say, coincidental. In fact, when you add up all these pieces together, it kind of spells out that this should have been obviously included and investigated all together along coinciding with the report, obviously, which it wasn't. Was there another point there that you wanted me to comment on? Because obviously I went off on a bit of a rant there.
No, I think that's all fine.
Sorry, the reason I think is because the topic of this is obviously to prove that the findings of the report are inaccurate. So as I said before, there is lots of points in it that are inaccurate. So if there's inaccurate points in the report's not accurate. So we could get in a debate like all day long, but the fact that these things have been proven 5 or 6 years later to have been inaccurate means the report's inaccurate.
I mean, okay, so I might need you to get to mute your speakers or something a little bit, because there we go. So if it's the basic intention of your case that so my interpretation of the 9/11 Commission report is that you had 2 planes flying into the buildings, and the subsequent results of that is what brought down not only those towers, but also WT7, and then also some other buildings that were sort of around there. You're saying that the inaccurate parts of the report is that there is a certain evidence that would imply that there was extra tampering or other sort of people working to try to make sure that these buildings came down, either by planting explosives or tampering with the sprinkler systems or doing other sort of things like that. The reason that I'm dubious, and I haven't read the files that you're citing, that the reason why I would be dubious that those things actually did occur, and that it wasn't just the case that the plane sort of flew into the building and the resulting rubble from that fallout did start a sort of chain reaction, which caused these other buildings to fall down and subsequently collapse. Would be that there has been quite a lot of investigation and scrutiny specifically around the causes of the main two trade centers falling. That has produced evidence that these have been people who are like 9/11 truthers, like convinced that the U.S. government has been behind it, and they've done substantial amounts of work to try to prove that. And while their findings have been inconclusive for those to actually prove that there was any kind of U.S. conspiracy behind it, it also seems that it would be inconclusive for the kinds of stuff that you're talking about. So in specifically the case to say that there were some sort of explosives that were planted anywhere to be able to, or bombing residue that would be planted that would cause additional structural damage to like World Trade Center 7 and other things like that. There was a lot of samples that were taken from that day. So you also, I think, before mentioned the fact that Mayor Giuliani at the time sort of shipped off various pieces away from the blast site and kind of went overseas. I don't think that that's particularly suspicious. I think at the time no one was treating it by like some sort of active crime scene that needed to be investigated. To most people, it would probably be pretty clear what happened. The two planes that flew into a building, and and they were just they were more concerned with trying to clear the rubble and deal with the aftermath of it than they were trying to like pour over the forensic evidence. But there have been numerous people that have done tests on like the dust and other things that have landed around the area in an attempt to sort of try to prove that that there was explosives or other sort of things in there. But if it was the case that those dust analysis didn't actually turn up with anything that would be categorized as being in any kind of explosives that they use. Also, if you watch the footage from any sort of thing that happened on that day, you see that when all the towers start to collapse, it happens as quite a gradual sort of process. And in fact, you hear many people being quite shocked when they say that it's sort of falling down, because it's kind of looming on the horizon and it all just sort of fall down. Any kind of explosion that sort of aids in the sort of demolition of the building in that way tends to necessarily be quite loud. Like if you watch videos of other sort of demolitions or things coming up, you hear that there's quite a noticeable sort of sound that emanates from that. So the lack of any kind of that would seem to indicate that that the things are sort of entirely consistent with the findings of the engineering report, saying that that office fires and other sort of things weaken certain structural things, which then caused the chain reaction, which caused the building to subsequently collapse. If you're saying that there are people who are who had access to these sorts of things and either didn't fix the sprinkler systems or purposefully didn't fix the sprinkler systems, or that there was a elevator shaft that perhaps wasn't sort of working in the day. Again, these things don't necessarily sort of prove any other kind of underlying any sort of like underlying thesis that undermines the core goal of the 9/11 Commission report, which is to sort of identify the aims and the sort of the intents behind going into the attack. So you can in fact say that that there are certain reports of the thing that of what people said or where they are that later have proven to sort of be inaccurate. I would be guessing that in most cases where they're directly reporting on what other people have said, that has been reported accurately. Whether or not that then later, the things that they said then later turned out or were proven to be inaccurate, again, does not necessarily undermine the accuracy of the report as the whole. If you have some responses to that.
Well, like they didn't take, it wasn't just like a few people saying that there were bombs. These people are witnesses to a crime, to like a heinous act. These are all witnesses, okay? So as in court, all the witnesses' accounts should be, taken into account. They cherry-picked which witnesses they would use for the report. So there was no mention that several people, all major media outlets, reported bombs, reporting hearing secondary explosions. At the time, several of the first responders, they have the firefighters group of first responders that have actually set up protest groups. They were at the crime scene after the first plane hit, and had witnessed like the lobby blowing out in the second building before a plane even hit it. So these are kind of things that are, you know, credible pieces of information. The first responders, all their testimony should definitely be included because they're the first people there. And to say, you know, Giuliani like acted negligent, just shipping the steel away, it's a crime scene. It's there was a terrorist attack. They didn't know what was going on. So in order to say, oh, it was cool for him just to ship a load of steel off to China, a load of evidence up there because he was just negligent, I don't really buy that, and I don't think that's really a credible argument. So as I said, the witness testimonies that were omitted and the fact he was shipping the steel away should have been, you know, key pieces to the report that they left out. And as I said, it's not like this debate isn't really about like how the buildings fell or the physics behind it, because I'm not a physicist, so I can't come in and prove to you the physics behind it. I'm not sure if you are either, but it's to prove that the report is inaccurate. And as I mentioned before, several pieces of it have been proven 7 years later to be inaccurate. So do you want to respond to that?
Certainly, yeah. So we might talk a little bit more about specifically the pieces that you're saying that you prove inaccurate a little bit later. But I think that once again, just talking about the, you know, a lack of omission from first responders. So I mean, firstly on the Giuliani thing, you know, maybe it is the case that, you know, it would have been better if certain pieces of rubble had been left there in order to be sort of poured over. Maybe it was reasonable at the time to move that away so that could better aid first responders or some other sort of thing. I'm not sure. I wasn't on the ground, and I have no authority to comment on what would be the appropriate action to take in that situation. But that doesn't necessarily reflect upon the, you know, that did happen, and, you know, that doesn't necessarily reflect upon the accuracy of the report that we're talking about. Secondly, on the omission of certain reports by first responders and other things like that, like, once again, just because certain people's accounts of things hasn't been put in the report does not necessarily make the report inaccurate, right? Like, I understand what you're saying, that you think that, you know, these people's testimony is very important and very valid and good, but, you know, once again, like, the perspective of someone looking at this thing saying, I think that these pieces of information are worth including in the report, may not be the same perspective as other people saying, well, we think that these are the relevant pieces of information including in the report. At the end of the day, when someone's looking to sort of, you know, write a report on these sorts of things, they have to make these kind of value calls about what is the valuable included information, what is the not valuable included information. It seems that, like, later, I'm looking at the report now, it seems that at some points later in there that they have sort of generalizing the kind of, you know, actions of first responders and what they kind of did on the ground. Maybe they thought, okay, that was, you know, enough to sort of describe the kinds of things that people were doing, that we didn't necessarily need to, you know, include every single detail to be able to make this accurate. And also, just generally speaking, I think that saying that, like, to try to, you know, say that this was a detailed report specifically of every perspective and every you know, person who was in fact there on the day, I think also might just be a little bit misleading as to the overall intention of the report. Like, if you look at it, the first 100 pages or so don't even mention, it takes until about sort of half or 3/5 of the way through the report before it actually gets to the events that happened on the day itself. So clearly what the report is trying to do is contextualize some broader information about the results and causes and geopolitical aims of the people who try to perpetuate this thing. So missing out certain details on the day, saying that makes the report inaccurate, I don't think is particularly compelling. I think that it perhaps makes a report of the, you know, exact perspectives of everyone on the ground might make it incomplete, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be what the report was trying to do. But if perhaps we can go back to some of the individual cases that you're saying have been proven to be false. So what was the first one you mentioned that has subsequently been disproven?
Was the dates that Muhammad Atta came to the States. They said they only learned about it was in June 2001 that he came.
Yeah.
obviously subsequent reports and leaked documents about 6 or 7 years later proved he was there a long time before that. And they had been they claimed they didn't even know anything about the guy until June 2001, and they had been tracking him from that Hamburg cell the whole time. So
okay, so just to respond to that specifically, who had been tracking them? Was it because as far as I'm aware, the 9/11 Commission report was written by people who were not necessarily within like high-level security agencies, but rather within that they were selected from like I think they were like members of Congress or other sort of politicians and stuff. So when you say that they had been tracking them, who specifically had been tracking them? Was it like an intelligence like CIA or?
Yeah, well, part of the investigation, obviously, they interviewed people from CIA, FBI, any of the top intelligence officials were all interviewed as part of it. The people selected. Now, this isn't obviously we're not going to get a debate about the people that were selected for the commission, but a lot of these guys had been involved in some precarious situation before. There was heaps of conflicts of interest. Philip Zelikow, one of the head guys, turns out he was reporting back to the White House about what was happening during the whole commission report. Lee Hamilton, another guy involved in the commission report, he was actually involved with the Iran-Contra scandal and a subsequent cover-up. That got obviously released a couple of years later. So not to talk about those guys too much, but those guys, so part of their investigation, they had obviously taken testimonies from, heads of the CIA, head of FBI, head of all the intelligence agencies, asked them what intelligence they knew and used that as their credible evidence. So the intelligence that they give and submitted was that they didn't know anything about the guys until June 2001. A couple of years later, obviously, that came out to be absolute bullshit. So again, the report is that part of the report is inaccurate. So I'm not saying that the whole thing is, but there's piece of it that have been proven to be inaccurate, and therefore the report's not accurate.
Right.
And also, probably to go back, another thing that I thought that I remember you said obviously there that, they're not going to, touch on all points and these guys with the bombs and the urban movement systems. Well, the guy that ran urban movement systems, Dominic Suter, he actually had received money a loan from for like $500,000 a month before it. And it turns out he, sorry, 1 second there. That's it. Yeah, so he was basically on the FBI's report of suspects for the 9/11 case. So he was one of their suspects to be involved in the obviously 9/11 attacks. Name not mentioned once in the report. None of those Mossad agents arrested were not mentioned once in the report. And I know you could say, well, there's a lot of things they left out. Not just to me, but any credible person that looked at the case would say that's a significant piece of evidence. Here's a guy that's on the, it's one of your chief suspects. You've got people associated with him, people working for him that are found with explosive in his car, and none of that's into the report. That, like, to me, that's absolute bullshit.
All right, certainly. But was the guy that was found with, was there ever any link that was made between his actions and any sort of intent to contribute to the events that took place on 9/11?
What do you mean, like why he would do it? Or he was obviously
as in like, so you're saying that like someone's been arrested with some explosives in their car. Yes, that seems like good police work. I would also arrest someone with lots of explosives in their car. But what link has been made between him and the actions that took place on 9/11?
Well, because they're a foreign intelligence agency. They also had been working. They had permission to be in one of the buildings on the day of the attacks. They had several of the vans that were spotted. There was another van that had explosives. Another one tested positive for explosives. A load of these guys were ex-Mossad agents. So they were a foreign intelligence agency arrested with explosives in their car on the day of 9/11. The owner of the company they were working for, as I mentioned before, was listed as a chief suspect. He had been receiving money, as proven, from Israel, or whoever you want to say in Israel. And also, so I just think it's a pretty credible suspect, if you ask me, and should have definitely been included in the report. So, as I said, I think the report just drew its own narrative and conclusions. You know what I mean? So it said, right, let's tie this to Al-Qaeda. We want to use Al-Qaeda for this. We're going to use Al-Qaeda as the fall guy and say that, you know, it was actually used as a pretext for the war in Iraq. And they were the perfect fall guys. So they just drew their own conclusion and just went with that and just fit all the pieces in, and anything else they just left off to the side if it didn't fit in with their narrative.
Certainly. So if it was the case that, so you're saying, so these people was a Mossad agent. So what group were they affiliated with? Were they?
Sorry, which ones? The Mossad.
So the people we're just talking about, the Mossad. What group are you saying that they are affiliated with?
What group?
Or what state or what like sort of actor are they affiliated with? Mossad. Yeah. Okay. Sure. So if it's not your case that so the planes that were hijacked and flown into the buildings was conducted by Al-Qaeda, right? That's something we agree on.
Yeah.
And so is it the case that these two groups are sort of working in tandem to try to carry out this attack? And if that's the case, has there been some sort of like proven link between these two groups cooperating in the past?
Yeah, well, Saudi Arabia and Israel have worked together several times before. And I know many people probably think, oh, well, isn't that contradictory? Like the Saudi Arabia, obviously Muslims, Israel's Jewish people don't really, or that Israel don't like Muslims. But no, several cases, there was actually, and it was actually a group back in, I think it was the 60s or 70s, and you can check this out on Wikipedia, whatever, the Safari Club. It was actually not a conspiracy. It was a group of like American, Saudi, and Israeli guys. They come together, meet secret meetings in order to establish like their plans for the future and work together on goals, how to get there. So it wouldn't be the first time that they've worked previous, and they've worked several times together currently, probably with a lot of the funding of the jihadist groups that's came out. A lot of intel has obviously came out that, you know, groups like Al-Sham and Al-Nusra actually have been working a lot with Israel. Subsequently, they get funded as well by Saudi Arabia. So it's not the first time that these two have worked together. They both have a lot of common enemies as well. They both obviously want to see the end of Iran, I probably think is the big thing on their case. And Israel had a vested interest, obviously, in this war. One, it causes obviously mass destabilization. They wanted America to invade Iraq, and with Saddam gone, now you obviously see they have what's his name gone as well. Assad on his way out. Israel will benefit from a destabilized Middle East, and they obviously have their plans of a greater Israel project to expand. If these countries are in rife and full of jihadists running around the place, it's a lot easier for them to keep grabbing land. So these guys actually have a vested interest. Also, Israel, I think it was pre 9/11, they had like a massive oil problem, and they couldn't get oil because obviously they're surrounded by a lot of people that hate them. And then after 9/11, they started getting all their oil from Iraq. As my good friend Ryan Dawson will say, Israel did have an oil problem pre 9/11.
Certainly. All right. So it's basically your contention that so if my characterization of the 9/11 report would point to the fact that you know, despite there being maybe discrepancies of things left out or stuff that people was reported to have said later disproven to be false, that my contention would be that overall the papers, the commission's findings was that the plot was orchestrated by people who had affiliations and sympathies and were connected to Al-Qaeda for the intention of trying to take a terrorist action on United States soil. And it's your conflicting opinion that that while that is true, that there are also people who are working in tandem with that, who have not been seen in the report and have not been accurately given the light that they, you know, deserve to be within the content of the report. Is that correct?
Yeah, and also obviously to add on that, so there was also obviously they had help within the U.S. government. Not saying George Bush as I said, as you probably know, like George Bush isn't clever enough to be involved in anything like this. He would be someone that would probably be on a last and now basis. He was just working with the intelligence that was given to him. But you only need a couple of people in key areas of like the Department of Defense in order to, you know, move an operation like this. And a lot of these guys were actually dual Israeli citizens. So you had guys. So as I said, like imagine like pre 9/11, or like at 9/11. There was all of a sudden uncovered that there was hundreds of North Korean spies living in America. And there was also several guys, Koreans, on the day of 9/11 arrested in vans filled with explosives, North Koreans, yeah? Also, there was guys in the government that were dual Korean and American citizens. Now, if all this evidence, and these guys would have and the end game, and what was a result of this was America going to war with South Korea, which the North Koreans would want, okay? Do you think if that was the case, that everyone would be up in arms and the investigation would have went in a completely different manner? But the fact that obviously it was Israeli involved, it's a much more sensitive subject, and because of obviously their strength and power in America, it's something that was just kind of swept under the rug and untouched.
It would seem to the idea that, so I mean, it's possible that so I mean, for context, I've not read any of these things that you're referencing that do prove the things that that you are talking about. I think that, you know, if so I can't necessarily comment on the specific accuracy of these things.
I'll post the links under here because they're all
certainly, yeah, that'd be good. So certainly if it was the case that, you know, that there was, you know, multiple you know, as you say, from people from North Korea who were working with it on the day, and that sort of pointed to some sort of aims to sort of radicalize American action against South Korea, that people would be suspicious and want to sort of take that, because then that would necessarily have to tie, you know, affiliations between, you know, both like Al Qaeda and North Korea sort of wanting to target two separate or like invasions or occupations of places against two separate groups. What I think that what I would just throw out as the kind of like you know, a bit of like skepticism in kind of working backwards from these claims is that I think that that given that what potentially might have happened here in order for people to be able to draw these conclusions is that they have noticed that that, you know, people who that Israel or other groups in the Middle East have had similar aims to what happened to occur in the aftermath of 9/11, mainly the invasion and occupation of Iraq, and have sort of worked backwards from there and says, well, wouldn't it have been really good if it was the case that those people had somehow been involved with that? The thing that sort of makes me skeptical about that whole sort of narrative and framing of things is that if it was the case that the members that were associated with Saudi Arabia and Israel in fact wanted the sort of invasion and occupation of Iraq, that you know, increased military presence within the Middle East was not necessarily the aim of Al Qaeda. The aim of Al Qaeda was to try to like take a terrorist act on American soil in order to sort of like force this like division that they've been using as to successfully recruit from that. So if it was the case that was happening, it seems that the aims of the people working together somewhat stand a little bit at odds with one another. Maybe it's the case that the two groups were that if all of this is true and that the, you know, it did occur how is being said, that the two groups were sort of playing each other off in order to sort of make all of this happen. But I guess I'm just sort of skeptical as to the entire logistics of how this whole thing would sort of unfold.
Okay, well, do you want just to jump in, because I think we only have a minute left.
Yeah.
Now, as you said, it's nice drawing a conclusion, you know, starting from the end game was saying Israel wants military intervention, and then kind of drawing your pieces from that. But these guys that were involved, these neocons, actually wrote policy papers on this pre-9/11, and they had been campaigning. Guys like Richard Pearl, Douglas Fife, had been campaigning Bill Clinton to invade Iraq. He said no. So pre-9/11, in February 2001, America started bombing Iraq and with the UK, and was met with mass protests. So it didn't work. So these guys had a policy paper written in August. I think it actually had like a Osama bin Laden maybe on the cover, and it said America needed a new Pearl Harbor type of event. Now also Wesley Clark, General Wesley Clark, NATO of the States, even has said several times that America had a policy of invading 7 countries just right after 9/11 that they'd drawn up pre 9/11 in order to establish military presence there before China becomes a